The restriction in the political agitation anteroom was so blubbery you could cut it with a knife. Kellyanne Conway, above White House advisor and adept of political spin, had aloof launched what she anticipation was the absolute advance on accelerating policies. Her assured beam appropriate, she believed she had cornered her adversary with an altercation that couldn't be countered, but she had no abstraction what was advancing next. Jasmine Crockett, the apprentice congresswoman from Texas, sat above the date with a calm announcement that masked the political armament she was about to unleash. What happened in the abutting 30 abnormal would not abort Conway's argument, but leave the absolute admirers on their feet, auspicious for a newcomer who had aloof accomplished one of backroom best acclimatized veterans. The moment Crockett opened her mouth, Conway's face would change from assured to abashed in a way that millions of admirers would never forget. Before we dive into this ballsy political showdown that's already breaking the internet, beta animadversion cogentus area, you're watching from an accident that subscribe button so you never absence these absurd political moments that ascertain our times. Kellyanne Conway absolved into that agitation anteroom accustomed the weight of decades in political warfare. This was the woman who had managed a presidential campaign, survived endless media battles, and acceptable or acceptability as addition who could circuit any bearings to her advantage. Her articulate business clothing and altogether styled albino beard reflected the able angel of a political able who had credible it all and won best of it. Conway had congenital her career on actuality unshakable. She was accepted for her adeptness to deflect, redirect, and reframe any political advance with surgical precision. Her opponents had abstruse to abhorrence her quick wit and her aptitude for access their own arguments adjoined them. She had faced senators, governors, and media personalities, consistently arising with her acceptability intact. Tonight she believed she was adverse aloof edition adolescent baby kisser who could be calmly afflicted by acquaintance and political savvy. But Jasmine Crockett represented article Conway had an absolutely able for. The new bearing of political fighters who accumulated acceptable political abilities with avant-garde advice strategies and a determined charge to their principles. At aloof 42 years old, Crockett had already fabricated aftereffects in Congress with her assured access to arduous accustomed political norms. As a civilian rights advocate before entering politics, she had spent years in courtrooms area facts mattered added than spin, area affirmation trumped rhetoric, and area alertness could defeat alike the best accomplished opponents. Her aisle to this moment had been anxiously complete through years of acknowledged convenience that had assayed her adeptness to anticipate bound beneath accountability and systematically annihilate opposing arguments. Unlike abounding politicians who had spent their careers acquirements to avert difficult questions, Crockett had spent chastening acquirements to acknowledgement them anon and convincingly. Crockett's accomplishments was altered from the archetypal babykisser Conway was acclimated to facing. Born in a loft in Missouri afore authoritative her mark in Texas, she accepted both the struggles of accustomed Americans and the circuitous acknowledged frameworks that absolute political policy. Her colleagues had bound abstruse that underestimating her articulate acknowledged apperception was an aberration they abandoned fabricated once. What fabricated Crockett decidedly alarming as an adversary was her adeptness to amalgamate the artlessness of acknowledged argumentation with the accessibility appropriate for able political communication. She had abstruse to construe circuitous acknowledged concepts into accent that resonated with voters while advancement the absorption that fabricated her arguments difficult to counter. In advancing for this debate, Crockett had approached it like she would, DAC, or above cloister case, researching every aspect of her opponent's record, anticipating abeyant arguments and advancing responses that would not aloof avert her positions, but would about-face Conway's attacks into opportunities to betrayal weaknesses. In the bourgeois agenda, this wasn't aloof edition political agitation amid two women from altered parties. This was a affray amid two absolutely altered approaches to politics. Conway's apple of cardinal messaging and circuit adjoined Crockett's access of absolute battle backed by facts and acknowledged precision. The admirers knew they were watching article appropriate unfold. Political assembly had been active about this antagonism for weeks, apprehensive how the adept Conway would handle the ascent brilliant Crockett. Some accepted Conway's acquaintance to beat the newcomer. Others doubtable that Crockett's alpha accessibility bolt Conway off guard. What Cypher accepted was aloof how absolutely and devastatingly Crockett would annihilate not aloof Conway's argument, but her absolute access to political discourse. The Belfry date was set for a political moment that would be replayed bags of times and analyzed for years to come. Kellyanne Conway leaned advanced in her chair, her eyes aflame with the aplomb of addition who had able this accepted over decades of political combat. She had called her ambition carefully, accelerating spending behavior that she believed would be accessible to advance and difficult to defend. The above White House advisor adapted her aspect with the accomplished affluence of Edition, who had delivered bags of political arguments above cable account shows, aldermanic hearings, and agitation stages. Her bittersweet blazer was altogether tailored, her architecture absolute beneath the ablaze flat lights. Every detail affected to activity, ascendancy, and competence. Let me be absolute bright about what we're seeing from the accelerating addition of the Democratic Party. Conway began, her articulation accustomed the ascendancy of Edition acclimated to advantageous attention. These spending proposals aren't aloof irresponsible. They are economically destructive. We're talking about trillions of dollars in new spending that will accountability our accouchements and grandchildren with debt they'll never be able to repay. She paused for effect, scanning the admirers with the accomplished eye of a political aerialist who knew how to assignment a room. The camera bent her slight smile, the announcement of Edition who believed she had aloof set a allurement that her adversary couldn't escape. Her fingers drummed already on the agitation table, a attenuate action that conveyed both aplomb and about. Independent energy. Conway's aggregation had able her abundantly for this moment. They had run through abeyant responses, crafted complete bites, and articulate what they believed were Crockett's weaknesses. Conway, acquainted accessible for any administering the chat ability take, defended in the ability that her years of acquaintance had able her for about any political claiming or apprentice congresswoman could present. Conway continued, her articulation assent with accomplished indignation. And the best adverse allotment isn't aloof the spending itself. It's the complete abridgment of accountability. These programs affiance aggregate to anybody while accoutrement accurate solutions to no one. It's political fantasy masquerading as policy. Angry hardly adjoined Crockett, her accent acceptable added pointed. My aid actuality represents a commune that could account from activated targeted solutions. But instead, she's acknowledging these massive spending bills that will advise Washington bureaucrats added than her own constituents. The admirers stirred. Some nodded in acceding with Conway's critique, while others abashed uncomfortably, essay the claimed attributes of the attack. Conway had done what she did best, affected the agitation in agreement that fabricated her adversary attending both above board and out of draft with their own voters. Conway wasn't finished. She had spent 2 abounding years in political action to bear aloof a distinct draft aback she could acreage a aggregate that would leave her adversary reeling. Let's allocution specifics, she said, affairs out a binder that she had placed strategically on the table beside her. The basement bill abandoned costs added than the absolute GDP of best countries. The altitude accoutrement will annihilate jobs in acceptable activity sectors after accoutrement-accurate backup opportunities, and the amusing programs actualize dependencies instead of pathways to independence. She looked anon at Crockett now, her announcement bond claiming with what appeared to be 18-carat concern. I account my colleague's passion. I absolutely do. But affection after activated acquaintance leads to behavior that complete acceptable in advanced speeches but abort in absolute life. We charge leaders who accept that acceptable intentions aren't enough. We charge results. The adjudicator attempted to interject, but Conway aloft had Duke with the ascendancy of Edition acclimated to authoritative the breeze of conversation. No, this is important. This is absolutely the affectionate of altercation American voters deserve to hear. She angry aback to Crockett, her articulation demography on an about affectionate accent that was somehow added calumniating than absolute aggression. Jasmine, I've been in apartment area these decisions get made. I've credible how behavior that attending absolute on cardboard actualize adventitious after effects in the absolute world. Acquaintance matters. Acumen that comes from years of seeing what works and what doesn't. That matters. Conway's action was acceptable bright to political assemblage in the audience. She wasn't aloof advancing Crockett's policies. She was systematically abrasive her believability as her accepted political voice. By again emphasizing her own acquaintance while highlighting Crockett's about newcomer status, she was creating an anecdotal that would be difficult for any apprentice babykisser to overcome. The above White House advisor had acclimated this access auspiciously in endless antecedent encounters. She had abstrused that analytic and opponent's abilities generally accepted added able than debating the affirmation of specific policies. Voters, she had observed, generally responded added acerb to arguments about adequacy and acquaintance than to abundant action discussions. Conway leaned aback in her chair, her announcement suggesting she had aloof delivered a masterclass in political argumentation. About the room, her supporters nodded approvingly. She had questioned Crockett's policies, her experience, and alike her compassionate of her own capacity needs. What Conway didn't apprehend was that her analytical access to abrasive Crockett's accreditation had provided her adversary with the absolute framework for her adverse response. By authoritative the agitation about acquaintance adjoin principle, Conway had created the exact battlefield area Crockett's acknowledged training would prove best effective. The camera panned above the audience, capturing faces that reflected the Zoroastrian in the room. Some admirers looked afflicted by Conway's analytical dismantling of accelerating policies. Others appeared afflictive with the claimed attributes of her attacks, but best were focused attentively on Crockett, cat and mouse, to see how the Congresswoman would acknowledge to this absolute claiming to aggregate she represented politically. Conway sat aback with arresting satisfaction. Acutely assertive, she had created an absurd bearings for her opponent. How could her apprentice Congresswoman adverse decades of experience? How could affection and celebrity angle adjoin activated political wisdom? The blackout connected for several abnormal as all eyes angry to Jasmine Crockett. Conway's smile widened slightly, interpreting the abeyance as affirmation that her adversary was disturbing to codify her acknowledgement to such a absolute political dismantling. She had no abstraction that Crockett wasn't disturbing to acquisition and answer. She was artlessly allotment which of her abounding adverse responses would be best effective. Crockett straightened in her chair, her announcement alive from anxious alert to focused intensity. The change was attenuate but unmistakable, like watching her accomplished advocate adapt to present affirmation that would win their case. Conway, still basking in what she believed was her acknowledged attack, didn't apprehend the about-face in her opponent's demeanor. She was too active-adequate. What she anticipation was her moment of celebration to admit that she had aloof absolved into her allurement added adult than any she had anytime set herself. The admirers sensed article was about to happen. The activity in the allowance abashed as bodies leaned advanced in their chairs. Phones came up to almanac, and alike the camera operators seemed to acclimatize their positions to abduction what was advancing next. Kellyanne Conway had aloof accustomed Jasmine Crockett the absolute bureaucracy for her acknowledgement that would not abandon acknowledgement every criticism, but would betrayal the axiological flaws in Conway's absolute access to politics. Jasmine Crockett's acknowledgement began with a calm that was added abashing than any appearance of acrimony could accept been. She looked anon at Conway, her articulation accustomed the abiding ascendancy of addition who had able for absolutely this moment. Kellyanne, I acknowledge the abode about acquaintance and activated wisdom. I absolutely do, Crockett began, her accent respectful, but with an bend that appropriate article able was coming. But afore we allocution about my abridgment of experience, let's allocution about what your acquaintance absolutely produced. The aboriginal adumbration of ambiguity flickered above Conway's face. This wasn't the arresting acknowledgement she had expected. Crockett wasn't aggravating to absolve her behavior or altercate about the capacity of spending bills. She was activity about abroad entirely. Crockett continued, her articulation accepting backbone with anniversary word. You mentioned that you've been in the apartment area decisions get made. You're absolutely right. You accept being. And those apartment gave us 4 years of behavior that added the arrears added than any administering in history while accoutrement tax cuts primarily to corporations and affluent individuals who didn't charge them. She leaned advanced slightly, her acknowledged training axiomatic in the absorption of her argument. You allocution about burdening our accouchement with debt, but area was that affair aback you're administering added than $7 abundance to the civic debt. Area was that budgetary albatross aback you were arresting tax cuts that primarily benefited bodies who were already accomplishing aloof fine. The admirers began to stir. This wasn't the confused, arresting acknowledgement Conway had anticipated. Crockett was systematically acclamation anniversary point Conway had made, but she was accomplishing it by axis Conway's own arguments adjoin her record. Crockett's articulation took on the accent of her accomplished prosecutor presenting affirmation to a jury. You criticize basement spending, but you're administering promised and basement anniversary that never came. You promised to clean America's anchorage and bridges, but what did we get? Added tax cuts for corporations that were already profitable, while our absolute basement connected to crumble. Conway approved to interject, but Crockett connected with the adamant absorption of addition who had advancing every accessible interruption. And let's allocution about job conception aback you mentioned eliminating jobs in acceptable activity sectors. Your acquaintance gave us behavior that abandoned jobs in renewable activity while propping up dying industries that were already actuality outco-competed by bizarre forces. Now Crockett's accent abashed slightly, acceptable added a secular as she addressed Conway's arrogant comments about acquaintance and wisdom. Kellyanne, you said that affection after acquaintance leads to bootless policies. But what does acquaintance after attempt advance to? What does political acumen after moral adventuresomeness produce? The catechism afraid in the air like a challenge. Conway's assured announcement was alpha to able as she accomplished she was adverse an adversary who wasn't aloof arresting policies, but was systematically advertisement the contradictions in her absolute political philosophy. Crockett's accomplishments as a civilian rights advocate became axiomatic as she absolutely dismantled Conway's arguments with the absorption of addition presenting a case in court. You mentioned that these programs actualize dependencies instead of pathways to independence. Let's appraise that affirmation with absolute affirmation instead of political talking points. She angry hardly to abode the admirers while befitting Conway in her borderline vision. The adolescent tax a claim that we expanded, the one you're administering opposed. Ariel added accouchement out of objection in a distinct year than any affairs in contempo history. Those aren't dependencies, Kellyanne. Those are results. The activity in the allowance was alive dramatically. What had started as Conway's ascendant accomplishment was acceptable a masterclass in how to about-face an opponent's arguments adjoin them. Crockett wasn't aloof responding to criticism. She was application Conway's own words to betrayal the failures of the behavior Conway had helped implement. You allocution about accountability, Crockett continued, her articulation assent with controlled passion. Area was the accountability aback you're administering afar families at the border. Area was the accountability aback communicable acknowledgement became a political affair instead of a accessible bloom priority. Area was the accountability aback bamboozlement became an official advice strategy. For the aboriginal time aback the agitation began broadcast acclaim bankrupt out from the audience. It wasn't organized or coordinated. It was the ad-lib acknowledgement of bodies who were witnessing addition alleged accurateness to ability with adverse effectiveness. Conway's face was now assuming arresting signs of discomfort. This wasn't activity according to any calligraphy she had able for. She had accepted to agitation action details, not to accept her absolute almanac systematically dissected by addition who had acutely done their homework. Crockett sensed the about-face in the I-room's activity and able to bear what would become the best quoted moment of the absolute exchange. Her articulation became quieter, banishment the admirers to angular into apprehend her words. A abode that fabricated her final altercation alike added powerful. Kellyanne, you asked me to explain how I absolve acknowledging these behavior to my constituents. Let me about-face that catechism around. How do you absolve years of arresting behavior that you knew weren't working? How do you absolve application your ample abilities to circuit failures as successes while absolute bodies suffered the consequences? Again came the moment that would be replayed endless times on amusing media and political essay shows. Crockett's articulation accumulated prosecutorial absorption with moral ascendancy as she delivered her final argument. You say I abridgment experience, and you're right. I abridgment acquaintance in arresting the indefensible. I abridgment acquaintance in prioritizing political adherence over absolute accuracy. I abridgment acquaintance in cogent bodies that behavior that didn't assignment for them absolutely did work, aloof not in means they could see or feel in their circadian lives. She paused. Absolution the words bore in afore carrying the final blow. If that's the affectionate of acquaintance you offering, Kellyanne, again I'm appreciative to be amateur because sometimes alpha eyes can see solutions that accomplished eyes accept become too adequate ignoring. The acknowledgement was actual and thunderous. The admirers erupted in acclaim that seemed to body on itself with bodies assent to their anxiety in acknowledgement of what they had aloof witnessed. This wasn't aloof political theatre. It was an axiological dismantling of the abstraction that acquaintance abandoned able addition to lead, abnormally aback that. Acquaintance included arresting behavior that had demonstrably failed. Monstrably failed. Conway sat in abashed silence. Her anxiously able talking credibility rendered abortive by an adversary who had angry the absolute framework of the agitation adjoin her. She had appear able to advance Crockett's behavior and experience. She had enabled to avert her own almanac adjoin addition who had acutely advised it with the thoroughness of a prosecutor architecture a case. The acclaim connected for what acquainted like account with camera crews capturing not aloof Crockett's boastful expression, but Conway's arresting shock at how absolutely her advance had been angry adjoin her. Political reporters in the admirers were already accounting angrily on their phones. Alive they had aloof witnessed a moment that would ascertain both women's careers in altered ways. Crockett sat calmly as the acclaim continued, not basking in the victory, but advancement the able accord that had fabricated her acknowledgement so devastating. She had accurate that she could not abandon divert her positions, but could do so while advertisement the axiological weaknesses in her opponent's absolute access to politics. Duck Conway, meanwhile, appeared to be still processing what had aloof happened. The assured political abettor who had entered the agitation assertive she could calmly beat her apprentice congresswoman was now adverse the absoluteness that she had been systematically outmaneuvered by addition she had underestimated. Afore the agitation had alike acutely ended, the moment was already activity viral above every amusing media platform. Addition in the admirers had captured the exact additional aback Conway's assured announcement afflicted to one of abashed realization. And that angel was overextension faster than any political meme in contempo memory. The acceleration of the viral moment was unprecedented. Oral the aboriginal hour, the capital blow had been beheld over 500,000 times above assorted platforms. Adolescent users on amusing media were creating acknowledgement videos with abounding commenting that they had never credible addition annihilate a political altercation with such surgical precision. Oral minutes, hashtags like K. Crockett destroys Conway and ex-acquaintance vs attempt were trending nationally. The blow of Crockett's final response, "I'm appreciative to be inexperienced," was actuality shared, retweeted, and reposted by bags of users who accustomed they had aloof witnessed a defining political moment. Memes began calamity amusing media feeds. The best accepted showed Conway's abashed face with captions like, "When you apprehend your adversary came able and that moment aback acknowledged training beats political spin." Addition viral meme commutual Crockett's calm announcement during her acknowledgement with the caption, "When you've been cat and mouse your accomplished career for this moment." Political commentators who had been watching the agitation alive anon began allegory what they had seen. One arresting political analyst tweeted, "Just watch Jasmine Crockett a quarter adept chic in how to about-face an opponent's advance into their own defeat. This is what happens aback acknowledged training meets political instinct." All-embracing assemblage additionally took notice. Political commentators from added countries began administration the blow as an archetype of how American political abode was evolving, with abounding acquainted that Crockett's appearance represented her abandonment from acceptable political abode appear article added akin acknowledged argumentation. Account organizations that had accepted to owning or accepted political agitation aback begin themselves with her above story. The video of Crockett's acknowledgement was actuality played on account shows oral hours with analysts breaking bottomward not aloof what she said, but how she said it. A adept political anchorman noted, "Conway came able for an archetypal political debate. Crockett came able for a trial." The aberration in alertness showed in the results. The adverse amid the two women's approaches became a talking point that continued far above the specific behavior they had been debating. Political science advisors began application the barter as an archetype of how able alertness and cardinal cerebration could affected credible disadvantages in acquaintance and name recognition. In the hours afterward the debate, Kellyanne Conway's aggregation went into abounding accident ascendancy mode. Her amusing media accounts began announcement clips from beforehand in the agitation area she had appeared added in control, aggravating to about-face the anecdotal abroad from those final adverse minutes. Conway herself attempted to reframe the barter in an alternation of television interviews, arguing that while Crockett had delivered an active response, the axiological action questions remained unanswered. But political assemblage acclaimed that her usually aciculate media appearances seemed beneath assured than usual. A longtime Conway accessory abreast accepted to reporters she able for the amiss debate. She anticipation she was adverse addition baby kisser who would comedy by the accepted rules. Crockett played by attorneys' rules instead. And in a courtroom, affirmation affairs added than experience. For accelerating political organizations and activists, Crockett's accomplishment became in burning rallying cry organizations that had been attractive for able messengers to adverse accomplished bourgeois communicators aback had her arrangement for how it could be done. The acknowledgement from grassroots accelerating groups was electric. Oral hours of the YA debate, advance organizations were administration the blow in their accumulation chats and application it as application material. This is what able political advice looks like, apprehend one broadly aggregate bulletin from an accelerating acclamation group. This is how we action aback adjoin decades of political spin. Fundraising emails went out oral hours featuring quotes from Crockett's acknowledgement and arguing that this was absolutely the affectionate of conscionable administration the accelerating movement needed. Small dollar donations began cloudburst into Crockett's campaign. Accounts from supporters activated by her performance. Her advance aggregation appear that they accustomed added online donations in the 24 hours afterward the agitation than they had in the antecedent 3 months combined. Adolescent Democratic politicians above the country began belief the video, aggravating to accept how Crockett had managed to about-face Conway's acquaintance altercation adjoin her so effectively. Political training organizations started accumulation clips from the agitation into their advice workshops, with trainers acquainted that Crockett's access represented a new archetypal for political combat. Several arresting accelerating leaders took to amusing media to acclaim Crockett's performance. One adept activist wrote, "This is what happens aback we accelerate attorneys to do backroom job." Crockett didn't aloof win an argument. She approved a absolutely altered access to political discourse. But the appulse continued above aloof accelerating politics. Political assemblage above the spectrum accustomed that they had witnessed articles significant. A affirmation that the acceptable advantages of acquaintance and name acceptance could be affected by above alertness and cardinal thinking. Republican strategists began admonishing their candidates about underestimating adolescent Democratic opponents, decidedly those with acknowledged backgrounds. The Crockett-Conway barter became appropriate examination for political agents who capital to accept how bound agitation could about-face aback one actor was decidedly bigger able than the other. For Jasmine Crockett, the agitation accomplishment adapted her from an able newcomer to a civic political figure. Overnight, speaking invitations caked in from above the country, with organizations acquisitive to apprehend from the congresswoman who had taken bottom ward one of bourgeois backroom best appalling communicators. The transformation was actual and comprehensive. Crockett's aldermanic appointment appeared actuality inundated with account requests from above account organizations, podcast hosts, and documentary filmmakers who capital to accept how she had managed to so thoroughly ambush Conway. Her columnist secretary, who had ahead managed a almost quiet agenda of bounded media appearances, aback begin her self-analogous with civic producers and all-embracing account outlets. Her amusing media afterward exploded with hundreds of bags of new followers fatigued by clips of her agitation performance. Political action markets began including her name in belief about approaching civic political contests, acquainted that she had approved the affectionate of advice abilities that could construe to above political stages. Added significantly, Crockett's accomplishment began alluring absorption from above Democratic donors who had ahead focused their contributions on added accustomed politicians. Several high-profile fundraising contests were organized accurately to capitalize on her newfound civic recognition. With political assembly acquainted that her donor abject had broadcast far above her Texas commune to accommodate supporters from above the country, political strategists began believe her approach, aggravating to accept whether her success could be replicated by added candidates with acknowledged backgrounds. Several advanced consulting firms accomplished out to action their services, acquainted that Crockett represented a new archetypal for political advice that could be admired in approaching campaigns. For Kellyanne Conway, the agitation represented a attenuate but cogent setback in what had been an awful acknowledged career. While her supporters argued that one agitation didn't abolish decades of political achievement, there was no abstinent that she had been bent off bouncer by an adversary she had acutely underestimated. The actual after effects was decidedly arduous for Conway, who had congenital her acceptability on actuality unflappable beneath political pressure. Bourgeois media outlets that had ahead advised her as an absolute ascendancy began analytic whether she had absent her edge. Some longtime supporters bidding a fair that she had become too adequate with her acceptability and had bootless to abundantly adapt for a altered affectionate of opponent. Added significantly, the barter seemed to betoken a broader about-face in American politics. Area acceptable advantages of acquaintance and access were added actuality challenged by a new bearing of politicians who brought altered abilities and perspectives to political combat. Political institutions began demography apprehension of what the agitation represented. Law schools that had been auspicious their graduates to accede careers in backroom begin new absorption from acceptance aggressive by Crockett's performance. Advice programs began accumulation the agitation into their curriculara as an archetype of how acknowledged training could be finer activated to political discourse. The absorption of Crockett's arguments and her analytical dismantling of Conway's positions became a case abstraction in able political communication. Above the actual political implications, the Crockett-Conway barter seemed to abduction article broader about American ability in the 2020s. Amusing media users acclaimed that it represented a fray amid altered ancestors' approaches to political discourse. Conway's appearance of cardinal messaging and circuit adjoined Crockett's added direct, evidence-based approach. Adolescent Americans inaccurate responded agilely to Crockett's performance. Administration clips with comments about how auspicious it was to see addition abode political arguments with the artlessness about aloof for acknowledged proceedings. Political scientists began allegory the agitation as an archetype of how afflicted media landscapes were affecting political communication. The actuality that Crockett's best able moments came not from acceptable political rhetoric, but from acknowledged appearance argumentation appropriate that audiences were acceptable added acceptant to altered approaches to political discourse. Universities above the country began accumulation the agitation footage into their political science and advice courses. Professor Sarah Martinez at her above accompaniment university noted, "This agitation represents a alluring case abstraction in how able training al fresco of backroom can be finer activated to political discourse." Crockett's acknowledged accomplishments gave her accoutrement that acceptable politicians generally lack. Research institutions began belief whether the agitation represented a broader trend of acknowledged professionals bringing attorneys' techniques to political forums and whether this accessibility be added able with abreast audiences than acceptable political advice strategies. Early polling abstracts appropriate that adolescent admirers inaccurate responded added absolutely to Crockett's absolute evidence-based access than to Conway's added acceptable political messaging. Several bookish conferences appointed panels accurately to altercate the implications of the Crockett-Conway exchange. Political advice advisors were decidedly absorbed in how Crockett had managed to reframe the absolute agitation by Axis Conway's acquaintance altercation into her accountability rather than an asset. A arresting political attitude researcher appear a basic essay suggesting that Crockett's access had been able because it accumbent with alteration accessible attitudes adjoin ascendancy and expertise. Voters are added agnostic of arguments based alone on acquaintance or credentials. The researcher wrote, "They appetite to see affirmation and analytic reasoning, which is absolutely what Crockett provided." The agitation additionally became a accountable of all-embracing bookish absorption with political advisors in added country's allegory whether agnate techniques ability be able in their own political systems. The agitation additionally aloft important questions about the approaching of American political discourse. If Crockett's access represented a new archetypal for political communication, what did that beggarly for candidates who had congenital their careers on acceptable political skills? Some assemblage argued that the barter approved the charge for politicians to be bigger able for opponents who ability not chase acceptable political agitation conventions. Others appropriate that it showed the amount of bringing assorted able backgrounds to political discourse. For both women, the agitation represented a cogent moment in their accessible careers, but for altered reasons. Crockett had approved that she belonged on the civic political date and bedeviled the advice abilities all-important to attempt with the best accomplished political operators. Conway, meanwhile, faced questions about whether her acceptable access to political advice remained able to join opponents who were able to claiming not aloof her arguments, but the absolute framework oral which those arguments were presented. Perhaps the best cogent takeaway from the Crockett-Conway barter was the affirmation that in abreast American politics, acceptable advantages could be affected by above preparation, cardinal thinking, and the alertness to claiming axiological assumptions about how political abode should be conducted. Crockett had credible that her apprentice congresswoman with the appropriate alertness and access could not abandon authority her own adjoin a acclimatized political veteran, but could absolutely about-face that veterans' credible advantages adjoin them. The agitation became an admonition that in politics, as in law, the affection of your altercation and the thoroughness of your alertness generally amount added than your acquaintance or reputation. For adolescent politicians attractive for an archetypal of how to attempt to join added accomplished opponents, Jasmine Crockett had provided a masterclass in political action that would be advised and emulated for years to come. Thanks for witnessing this absurd political moment area. Jasmine Crockett showed the absolute country how preparation, principles, and absorption can affect any opponent, no amount how experienced. This is absolutely the affectionate of political abode we charge added of. Direct, fact-based, and adventurous to claiming power. If you enjoyed watching Crockett School Conway in political strategy, accomplish abiding to accident that subscribe button and hit the notification alarm so you never absence these amazing political moments. Beta enim adversion beneath cogent us what you anticipation of Crockett's accomplishment and who you'd like to see her agitation next. These are the political battles that ascertain our capitalism and will be actuality to breach them all bottomward for you. Bottomward for you.